As we move into the novels of the course, I wanted to make a few comments on aspects of plot as they are defined within the novel. To define the novel, basically, it's an extended work of prose fiction. Usually it means a piece of writing that is over 100 pages long, somewhere beyond the long story or novella here. And versus the short story's kind of singular effect, as Poe argued, as we looked at earlier, the novel can kind of become what Henry James called a loose, baggy monster. So there can be all kinds of different plot points and storylines that develop themselves as the novel builds itself in the writer's imagination. The novel can be an exploration of space and time. It can move in and out of a defined present. It can move back in time. It can move across the world geographically or throughout the universe geographically. So they're all different kinds of moves that the novel can make, and often the novel itself is defined by its genre. And you walk into a bookstore and you see the different classifications of kinds of novels, and novels will often play with those genres as well. Literary fiction will, play with the expectations of a mystery novel or fantasy or science fiction novel or romance novel. These kinds of things can kind of help to develop moments of play in a literary novel's plot. At its heart, though, the novel depends upon some basic, simple plots again. As we noted with the short stories, there may only be two basic plots. A man or woman went on a journey, or a stranger came to town. And you can kind of think about how the various novels in our course reflect those basic plots. Versus a short story which focuses on a central conflict, a novel will contain a series of conflicts, perhaps, in which the protagonist defines his or herself against others through against the past or the future, against the prevailing society and cultural norms. I always kind of like to think about within the novel what the novel's economy is, what's in short supply for the character, and what is that character willing to trade to have that thing that's in short supply. I think it's a good way to kind of think about the character and the character's wants in a really kind of tight, focused way. In our novels, you can perhaps think about the economy of the story there. You can also read the novel as a series of scenes, much as they would appear on a stage or in a film. Points of contained interaction or moments of focused conflict as the character or characters define themselves as they move from one scene to another, as the conflicts are introduced, resolved, or heightened as the novel progresses. And you can also think about the novel as a series of spaces, where those are geographical, familial, social, psychological spaces that the character moves through as kind of stages along the way. The novel can also be a more obsessive form than the short story is. Elif Batuman, a literary critic and writer, thinks about the short story as maybe an exhausted form in contemporary fiction. The novel, though, is a more ironic form that can be reinvented in various ways and in various kinds of play and how the writer tells the story. Here, one of those kind of basic, obsessive, and reinvented points is how the character's psychology develops within a particular novel. Some ways you might want to think about the novels in our course are to think about, whether this is a novel where the story is one of resolution or dissolution. Does the character come to a moment of resolved self-understanding by the story's end, or does the character come apart bit by bit as the story progresses? How is the central character able to hold a self together against the outside forces or the conflicts that surrounds him or her? Kate Chopin's The Awakening is a great example here. Do you read this as a novel of resolution in which Edna Pontellier redefines herself against the society and culture in her final act, or does that society and culture kind of cause her to dissolve psychologically as the story goes on? You can also think about psychological aspects here as the character falls under the influences of various kinds of irrational forces that we all deal with within life. So how does death affect the character? How does desire or sexuality affect the character? How do the kind of cultural myths of growing up or aging impact the character here? So you can look at those basic irrational forces of human experience and see how the character responds to those things. And the novel also is an obsessive form as a literary object, right? Just to sit down and say, I'm going to tell this gigantic story of all these different things. I'm going to bring the whole world into a story is, an obsessive act by the writer. And quite often you'll see writers, play with that sense of the novel as an obsessive drive within their storytelling. And perhaps you can see the folds of that within the novels we're looking at in the course. A few things to note in terms of novels within an American tradition, a few kind of guidelines or questions at the outset that you might want to think about. What America does the writer narrate? So as you read, think about that old question of setting, or what is the novel's socioeconomic world here? Is this a novel that focuses on the particular interactions culturally and socially within a particular region? So Kate Chopin's The Awakening, for instance, is very focused on New Orleans and Louisiana culture and society. Other writers are more expansive, as they take to the road and look at a wider America. We'll look at that in other novels later in the course, perhaps. You can think about what genre this is, in what ways, if you were going to put this on a shelf in a bookstore someplace, do you read this as a mystery, as a work of fantasy, as a romance? How do those other kinds of literary genres influence, the way that you read this? Is this a mythic story, perhaps? And how do you see, perhaps, other mythic stories underneath? In some cases, critics have looked at Edna Pontelier's story as a kind of Aphrodite story. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, emerges from the ocean. Edna Pontelier returns to the ocean. So she's kind of an upside down Aphrodite in that way. Maybe you'll see other myths in the stories here as well. What defines the character's journey through the Americas? Is it one of resolution or dissolution in America? As you look at novels about race and how it works itself out in American culture, sometimes the character finds a point of resolution, and sometimes the character falls apart as he or she moves through a racialized America. And then finally, do you read a novel as a tragic story? And is there a distinct American tragedy? And if there is, what defines that? Versus the stories of kings and queens in Shakespeare and in the Greek tragedies. Is the American tragedy here perhaps more of a distinct narrative of a common man or woman? And how does their story have kind of basic implicit tragic elements there as they slowly come apart? So these are some guiding kind of basic plotline things that you can think about as you go into the novels in the course, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on them. Thanks.